what we want. Okay. Beautiful. All right. So now all of you can fall asleep without me noticing. Welcome to my talk. We're talking about where do you go from here, where here is wherever you are. And I came up with this talk because I needed another talk for this. But it's something that I've been thinking about off and on for a while, since I tended for a long time to be the most experienced, oldest with the most gray hair person at my company. And what would happen is we would have a new developer come on, and we'd learn a whole bunch of stuff, sometime together. It was very sweet. And they would say, okay, now what? What do you mean? Well, what should I be learning now? Like, I've learned this thing. Now what do I do? And it happened so often that I decided that there had to be some way of answering that, or that should be an answer that people should be looking for. And I asked around a little bit, and I found out that this wasn't just a personal problem that just I had. It was a problem with just about anybody who was an independent developer, or who had taught themselves, or they worked in a small department, or as an independent contractor. They got to someplace, they were making money, and so maybe their business was developing, but their coding skill wasn't, because they could get things done. They could set up Drupal. They could do the stuff in Drupal if they wanted. They could set up WordPress and do the stuff that they wanted. They could theme WordPress. They could write PHP applications or Python applications. And so they kind of dug themselves into, I don't want to say a rut, but a habit. Like, they did the same thing the same way all the time because that's what they knew. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about getting beyond that and the places that you can go. So if you are in a place, where to go from there. That's where the title for the talk came from. And so I sent out a little questionnaire to a bunch of people who are smarter than me, like Corey Condardo and Paul Bissix and Patrick and a couple of other people, and just asking that question, like, what should people be learning? And I'm going to take anything that we talk about here, so when you guys are like, oh, but you forgot, which I probably did, and anything that I've forgotten, you can blame those names that I just gave you. It's all their faults. I'm perfect. Just to let you know, for people watching at home, they're actually sitting in the audience. So, development basics. Most of you are somewhere around here. If you've been developing for any length of time, you know what variables are. You probably know what objects are. You have an idea of data structures, things that are beyond strings or numbers, how you put data together into larger structures. Those are data structures. How to write a function, so a thing that you pass variables to, and that does something with the variables. Logical structures, how to control your code so that it does this, or it does this repeatedly, or it does this until this other thing happens. Those are all logical structures. They're control structures. And how to split up your files, your scripts and things, into multiple files so that they're not all in one place. If I have said one of these things to you and you're like, no, I have no idea what you're talking about, stop and get familiar with all of these things. These are going to be important to your continued health as a developer. These are the absolute basics. You're not really going to get very far without a pretty good understanding of this. You can probably set up WordPress. You can probably set up Drupal. but you're not going to be able to go further than that without understanding what's going on with these. So beyond development, because that's only one part of your programming health. And as I'm going to talk about, just because you're a technologist, there are kind of different classes of technologists. Maybe you're a developer. You want to get code on the page. You want to make the car run. You want to make things happen. That's great. There are also process technologists. So you want to build the roads and the garages and the things that allow cars to function. From a more concrete point of view, you want to set up the servers. You want to make sure that developers' codes get somewhere. You want to make sure that developers' code gets tested. This is process stuff. This is also a part of development that may interest you and that you might be able to explore as you're learning stuff. And if you guys have questions, something that's there or something that I've said, just stop me and ask. I'm willing for this talk to go totally off the rails so that we can talk about your development and coding health. If you're going to do process, your basics, version control. Version control is making sure that your shit is backed up. Making sure that if something gets messed up, you can roll back to an earlier version of what you've done and retrieve that version so that if you've really gone off the rails, you have a safety net. Or if you're in a larger shop, if somebody else has really gone off the rails, you can recover from that. Those are things like Git, Mercurial, and SVN are kind of the big three open source version control. There's other closed source stuff, but most people will have experience with one of these three. Deployments. So especially as you have more clients and more size to your organization, the active deployment is taking your code and getting it to where somebody can use it. And it starts off really simply. Like your deployment is, I have this working on my local machine, I FTP it up to the sites, I'm good. Once you start having more clients and having to remember different passwords, or there's some other more complicated process that goes on here, you want to stop having to think about what you're doing. So you want your deployment to start happening automatically and for certain things to happen without you having to think about them every time. Or think about, I did this deployment and now I have to update the database and now I have to back up the database and the images didn't go up. And the less thinking you or your programmer, if you're going to be the process guy, has to think about it, the better. These are things like Fabric or Heroku or a bunch of other services that do things for you. I think Ruby there's an RV something with Ruby, and with JavaScript and other things like that, which would be like JavaScript meaning Angular, Ember, Backbone. There are things like Grunt that do things for you. And then there's dependency control. So as you are getting bigger and bigger things, you're actually going to find out that other people have already written things, and you don't want to write them again. Somebody has already written something to resize images for you. Somebody has already written something to do this thing, and you just want to use their code. You want to use that library. Now, they're going to be updating their stuff while you're working, and your code will then have a dependency on that code, and you want to be able to control that. There are things out there that make this easier. It used to have to do all of this by hand. It was a mess. It was a pain in the ass. But now you have things like Composer for PHP, or pip for Python, and Bower for JavaScript, which will basically go out, find, say, the newest version of TinyMCE, which is used for WYSIWYG in jQuery, make sure that it's bundled with your stuff. All right. All of these process things help you do more coding and less thinking about the boring stuff. And there is somebody in your organization, which might be you, be responsible for making sure all of this works. Architecture. So this is everything that stuff is built on. Servers. Servers meaning database servers, your host, all of that infrastructure that keeps things going. Make sure you know what your different servers are. You know, a lot of tutorials kind of gloss over, this is a database server, this is a web server, this is your host, and those may be different machines and things like that. As you program more and the things that you are programming get more complicated, the differences get more important. So it's good to learn about this stuff before you have to and before something goes wrong. Because the person that you call for your database server may be a different person than you call for, say, your host. And you want to know the difference. You also want to know how does HTTP work? And so that's when a browser makes a request, it goes to first your web server and then to your application server, which might talk to your database server, and how that all comes back. And then you want to know about the stack. So the stack is basically the stack of how all of this works together. So when somebody says, I am a full stack programmer, that means that they have a pretty good understanding of everything from the Linux that it's running on, you know, the Linux or Windows that it's running on, to the database servers, to the application server, to the web server like Apache, and then all the way to the front to, hey, I can write HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Full stack programmers are often, like, their point of focus is often somewhere along there, so they're probably better at one than the others. But that, if you want to learn about putting stuff together in a large-scale way, especially if you're like, wow, really giant databases like the Amazon stuff or Facebook, that's fascinating. If that fascinates you and you want to get good at that, you want to make sure that at the basics, you understand how all this goes together. And Johanna, as we were talking just before this, kind of slapped me in the face with a comment that she made. She was talking about content. And I have totally left content off this in the worst way possible, which means there's an entire portion of this where if I've said all these things and you're like, yeah, but my favorite thing is actually talking about content with the client and making sure that their client stuff, I have done that their client stuff, that their client writing and their images and stuff is really good, then I'm doing you a disservice right now because I hadn't even thought of that, because my focus is on all the techie, geeky stuff that involves never talking to somebody. So you should go vote Johanna. Both because of that, because she's really smart. But there is the basics and intermediate and stuff for content people too. Like basic content, get something on the page, then SEO and etc. But there are better people to talk to, and maybe we can have a discussion about that later. So all of this is basic stuff. To some extent, if you're going to be a developer for any length of time, you should have an understanding of all of these basics, because all of these are things that will bite you at some point. At some point as a developer, your database server is going to go down, and you need to know what that looks like. Because it means that something has happened and it's not your code. It means you can't necessarily do something about it. You have to call somebody to do something about it. All right, is everybody with me so far? I haven't totally lost somebody. And does anybody have any questions yet? They can even be snarky questions. I'm okay with snark. Okay, so now you've got your basics in. You know, you're pretty good with the application stack. and you have written functions, and you kind of have a relatively good process. Yes?
It seems like this is very much a stack for a web developer.
It is kind of a stack for a web developer, but we can go into things like, because some of this, if you're looking for say C# or you're looking for Swift or Objective-C or Java, functions and all of that are still going to be important.
Yeah. I was just thinking about the kind of the last page. I was wondering how they might switch.
Okay.
Doing web development.
So I'm going to give you a little secret. If you're developing for mobile, those are going to still be important to you. Because for the most part, when you're developing for mobile, you're developing something, and a lot of times it's going to communicate with some sort of back end. And that's going to still be important to you. If you're developing a game and it really never talks to the back end, then you can ignore that architecture part. Your architecture is going to be more like memory management. And because if you're developing for mobile, that's like the thing that you need to understand to prevent crashing. Which means that you have to understand pointers. So if you don't have a good understanding of pointers and memory management, you're going to be crashing all over the place, and you won't know why. I know that from experience because I've had to debug crashing in back when it was iOS 3, and they did not have very nice ways of counting pointers. Excuse me for 1 second while I have some water. This is more talking than I usually do in a day. So that was a little architecture for your developing things on a computer, which could be a mobile computer or a regular computer. It's still, you have to understand your architecture. You have to understand the hardware that you're running on. And remind me of that when we get to advanced architecture, because I can talk to you about registers. So intermediate architecture is things you're going to start stacking more onto what you're doing. That you need to know things like model view something design. Some people will say controller, some people will say other thing, but it's the separation of your code into this is the data, whatever that is. That could be game state, or map state, or it could be records in a database. And view is how the user is looking at it. So that is how the user is going to be interacting with stuff. And then the star it's usually controller, but it doesn't have to be, because different paradigms will call it different things, but it's basically how you're getting the data to the view. How you're getting the model stuff to the view. So all the stuff in between there is covered by that. Caching, which is you've done something once, you save that, and you want to keep using that data. Caching is really important in anything networked because it allows the network to be sped up. You keep things closer to the user so that they get it sooner, so it doesn't bottleneck, or you cache on the browser. Or in the case of mobile devices, you can cache images. You can cache images and page them in and out. That's something that I've had to do before, where I prep an image off screen while they're doing something else, and then you do a page flip, and that's an imaging computery talk page flip, where you take that image from off screen in memory and show it to the user. It's all a method of caching. It's doing stuff while the user isn't looking, so that when they're ready for it, it's right there. That's taking the answer time. And then finally, the CDN is a content delivery network. That is spreading out your assets so that you keep the cache, the information, as close to the user as possible, as well as spreading out the load. And that is kind of an inherently web design thing. So architecture intermediate. Some of these are actually really easy. Like MV Design makes your life easier when you're architecting it. And CDN nowadays, like in WordPress, there's a plugin. Like you put in a WordPress plugin and type in like your CDN account information, and it just does it. It kind of boggled my mind when I first saw that because it felt like cheating. Okay, development intermediate. This is probably where a lot of people are going to be heading. Object-oriented programming. That's a biggie. Most things use object-oriented programming now, leaving out the debate of object-oriented versus functional. And you should understand how to do it, what an object is. And this is whether you're doing stuff for the web or not, because Objective-C is exactly that. I mean, they came up with a whole other language, C++ over C, just because they wanted to get objects in there.
What's wrong with object-oriented COBOL?
There's nothing wrong with object-oriented COBOL. You can actually make a truckload of money doing COBOL these days. So static versus non-static variables, so that when you see that keyword, you understand what it means and what it's doing for you. Generics, vertical and horizontal inheritance. All of these are concepts inside of object-oriented programming that you should understand as you are learning object-oriented programming. And just because I've thrown a concept up here does not mean that I am an expert at it. For the vertical and horizontal inheritance and generics, I'm totally blaming Patrick. Like I mostly understand inheritance, but then he started talking about vertical and horizontal inheritance, and he totally lost me. So there are things on here that I haven't learned yet, which tells me there are things that places that I have to go. And here, for you C programmers and people who are working on devices, here are references and pointers. They're important if you are doing stuff for the web, but for C and F# and a lot of the other programs in there, programming languages, especially if they don't do their own garbage collection. And you can ask me about garbage collection as soon as I take a breath. They are killers. It is, if you don't understand what's going on with references and pointers and why they're important, you should. Libraries. This is where I was talking about including files and stuff like that. You should know that there are libraries out there, and you should know to use them. You don't. People have been programming for 20 years. Someone has made an image compressor for you. Don't write your own unless you are really passionate about compressing images. Use the work that somebody else has built. That's exactly what Drupal is. It's basically a huge library that creates a content management system. Don't do the work yourself unless you're passionate about it, you think you have a better idea, or it doesn't exist out there. Look for a library. For PHP, there are things like PECL or Pear. I'm sure there are places to do stuff for Ruby. I know there is PyPy for Python libraries. There's stuff out there. Learn how to use them, because usually it's really simple. It's basically saying, hey, use this library, and then you just get to use all the functions in there. Frameworks. And there are two things about frameworks. You want to learn how to use them because they make coding easier. They deal with a lot of things for you. The three biggies that I know of are Rails, Django, and Laravel. Some people would call Drupal a framework. I don't feel that they are telling you the truth, because it is very specifically for content management systems. But these are ways of making programming easier that are general purpose. They do heavy lifting like the database connections and HTTP responses for you. It makes coding faster. It can change your time to program something from 10 hours to an hour. I had just experienced this. Again, like I was a Django programmer for a while, and then I stopped to do something else, and then I went back to Django, and I had just forgotten how amazing it is. And there are frameworks that are not just for web languages, because most of what you're using when you're using Cocoa for Objective-C is a framework that Apple came up with to make developing for their mobile devices easier. There's equivalents for Android, and if you really want to use JavaScript on your mobile device, that's what PhoneGap is. It's a framework to make programming easier on your mobile device. Learn them, and more importantly, read them. One of the best ways to learn how to code is to read the other person's code. Frameworks are the result of years and years and years of people getting sick of doing the same thing over and over again. But they're the result of doing the same thing over and over and over again. So it's people who have had a lot of practice doing something. So the way they do things in here will tell you a lot about good ways to program. I'm going to do a little pause again. Any questions? Yes?
I feel like I'm just misunderstanding something, but libraries and frameworks sound really similar.
Frameworks are larger scale. Frameworks try to do everything for you. Libraries tend to be very specific. Like, you can have a library that does human manipulation. But a framework guides the programming of your entire application. So libraries tend to be more focused. That's really the difference. If you look at something like Laravel, it actually uses a whole bunch of different libraries to make the framework. And thank you for bringing that up. That's actually a really good point. APIs are application programming interfaces, and that is a way to use outside things to solve a problem. These are things like accessing Google Maps, or accessing Google Mail, or Google has a lot of them, accessing Facebook. It's a good way to learn how disparate programs fit together and how to communicate with them. Because you can use an API to have two things communicate when they aren't necessarily in the same language. And it's an important thing to understand. Or learn another programming language. If you know PHP, learn Python. If you know Objective-C, try JavaScript or Swift. Because different languages have a different point of view. Because they will have been developed in a different way to solve a different problem. PHP started out because people wanted to add a little bit of functionality to web pages, and it grew from there. So it has a different perspective than Python that was developed as more of a general purpose language. And it will teach you a different way of thinking about code. One of my friends, Paul Bissix, he says the next language that anybody should learn is Haskell, because it has a very different way of thinking about code. Okay, I feel like I didn't complete this slide. But this also reflects my inexperience with advanced architecture. So you've done some caching. You've done a bunch of stuff with the architecture of how things work together, how to make large-scale things. Now you're into really large-scale things, balancing the load between two servers that have to now share state. So by now you will have learned about sessions in PHP and how to keep somebody logged in. Well, sessions are server-based. How do you transfer that server if your load is too high on one, and you need to transfer that session from one server to another? How does that work? How do you set it up? What is the best way to do something like that? This is when you're talking about really large-scale stuff. If you have like if you have somebody who has one store, in Northampton, and they want a website, you're probably not going to get here. But it's something to look at if you are fascinated by how this works. If you're like, how does Facebook serve thousands of people a second? And so you're like, well, I look into load balancing, and then you try to find a job in a large-scale enterprise like that. I mean, WGBH, it's not a huge company, but their websites serve thousands of people a day. Like Downton Abbey, the new season started, and the servers looked like they lit up red. It was a very scary time for the people who were on that development project. And that was people who were just learning about load balancing. Like, this is not something that WGBH had always had experience with. We basically went to the people who were already doing stuff with the servers and said, who wants to learn about load balancing? Nobody raised their hand, so somebody got picked. No. Actually, we have a bunch of very smart people working on it because somebody is always interested in advancing their knowledge somewhere. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here, is not you have to know all these things, but know about where you can go. Know about kind of what these things are so that you know what you might be interested in. Okay, process advanced. Just to make sure that you guys you don't think that I've forgotten about you. So once you start having to support lots of people and maybe lots of different kinds of systems, you want to start looking at what's a virtual environment. So I have one computer, and I have to develop for Windows and the Mac and Unix. So how do I deal with that without having 3 computers?
Virtualization.
There you go. So you have a virtual environment, which is stuff like Vagrant, that basically runs another computer inside of your computer. Or to a lesser extent, you have something like VirtualEnv, which is the Python answer to this, which just allows you to install things that work just in that session. So that it doesn't clutter up everything with the 12 Python libraries that you need. They should be easy to set up and easy to tear down, and they shouldn't make you pull your hair out. I feel like in the past 5 years, they have really gotten to the place where they're easy to use. I remember my first experience with them wasn't great, but that was like 10 years ago. And then I just tried Vagrant a little while ago, and it was amazing. It was like eating ice cream. It was awesome. But it allows you to do development on your machine in various environments. Continuous integration. So you're a team of developers, and you want to make sure that anytime that you roll out a change, it doesn't kill Tom's changes. It doesn't do horrible things to the code that Tom has been working very hard on. Even on the development environment, because there may be people who are testing there, or doing other kinds of work there, like maybe content creation. So you want a system that when you complete something and you push it out to because you're a process person, when you push it out to your Git repository, it automatically runs certain tests, and it automatically merges things, and it automatically puts that into the development environment. So it is a continuous integration cycle without somebody having to sit there and take the file and move it over here, and then run the tests, and then take it from there and move it over to be merged with the other code, and then take it from there and put it on the development server, or take it from there and put it on the testing phones. There is a process for all of that. There are systems that will do that for you automatically. So if you're a process person, you want to be looking into stuff like this, because as a process person, you are trying to smooth the road out for everybody else. And test-driven development. So, and I wasn't sure if this should be here or in development, but I feel like the process part of this is setting this up so that there is a test. You know what the test is. You can run the test and have the developers react either by sending them tickets to either by sending the development team tickets for tasks that they have to do as a result of your test, or writing the tests, or just making sure that that process is relatively smooth for your developers. This is it feels like this is like the process is like the service-oriented part of technology, where if things are going right, you get no credit. If things are going badly, everybody's angry at you. But I am always very thankful if I have a process that just happens. Somebody introduced me, I think I talked about Fabric a little while ago, somebody introduced me to Fabric, and an hour of fiddling with things turned into a one-line deployment that any of the dev team could do. And I was the most thankful person ever that happened. Because it meant my Fridays were not a nightmare. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay. Advanced development. And I have some stuff up here, but if you want the truth, there is so many other things that you can be doing that this should be like 4 or 5 pages. Things like non-relational databases. So most of what people use nowadays are things like MySQL, Oracle, and Postgres and SQL. And those are all relational databases. They are built with a certain perspective. They're built to work a certain way, where in how records relate to one another. There are other kinds of databases out there. There are things like NoSQL databases, where everything is just like a big heap of strings. I know it's more complicated, but I'm trying not to get into the nitty-gritty details of stuff like this. And there are also object-oriented databases where everything's an object. There are pros and cons for each of these. There are different places to use them. One of the sponsors here, Fixu, I believe, does large-scale databases. So anybody from Fixu would be a good person to talk about the different types of databases and how they might work. Functional programming rather than object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming is the big thing that everybody knows about. Functional programming is the other thing that people talk about. And again, much like the different types of databases, there are specific uses for that. A lot of times people say that it's faster. And it may have other advantages if you are interested in exploring it. And it's good to be able to contrast something like that with what you're already doing. You also start to, once you get to advanced development, you also start to think about things like the complexity of what you're doing. And once you start thinking about that kind of complexity, you start thinking about algorithms like searching algorithms and graphing algorithms, and sorting algorithms, which is a lot of what a computer does. Like everything that ends up happening, like image manipulation, is really the computer searching through bits of information, changing them, and then sorting them back into order. So algorithms for searching and sorting are very important. And you talk about complexity for searching and a lot of other things with something called Big O notation, which talks about complexity. And the reason for that whole spiel is there's a whole separate language when you're talking about orders of complexity that you'll have to learn. You'll also learn about complex data structures like stacks and trees, and how those are used, and again, because what computers do is mostly searching and sorting, at some level, how those are used for searching and sorting. And again, there's a whole other language, hashes and things like that, that will help you when talking about stuff like this. And I know I haven't even gotten to other, like, even larger scale concurrent programming, threaded programming, parallel processing. There are lots and lots of other things that that you can learn about, or even just ways of doing it. Like there's complicated things that you can do with UI. Like if you are a front-end designer / developer and you know everything there is to know about HTML and CSS, and you can make awesome designs, maybe it's time to make those designs do something. You know, maybe it is time to look at user experiences. So it's not just my page looks awesome, but the entire experience from one end to this website to the other does something. Game designers especially should be looking at user experience because it talks to things like how to monetize stuff. The whole free-to-play system, there are people who talk about the user experience of that and where it's good and bad. There are people who will talk about, you know, bringing it back to web development. There are people who will talk about the user interface and when it's good to have things move and when it's good to not have things not move, and the difference between user interface and user experience, because those are actually two totally different jobs when you get to a certain size. Where you get to talk about how this user interface will affect this user experience. You know, so there's like a whole other set of slides for people who are front-end developers. You know, you've learned the HTML and the CSS. Now maybe it's time to learn Angular to make that easier for you. You know, so that maybe you talk more directly to the database and interface in a different way rather than I submit this form, the reply page comes back. You know, and to think about a design other than the simple web page form design. So yeah, that is where to go. That is kind of like an overview of everything I could think of at the time that I was doing this. I hope that it was helpful, and now I'm going to, we have 5 or 15 minutes, depending on how you want to look at it. So I'd like to just say, if people have questions or commentary, like, why did you forget this? I would love to hear about it. Your hand is, like, you've been waiting to put that hand up, Patrick.
I was just curious how you solved the load balancing issue at WPH.
Oh, I don't know.
You can talk about it.
Money. But
We waited for the problem to go away.
actually, like I said, a lot of these things I'm not really familiar with. In the case of WGBH, we actually handed it off to Amazon, and we work a lot with the Amazon EC2 stacks, and we offloaded all of the media to that, so that all the images and stuff, which were the biggest downloads, were put over there, and we made sure that our caching was pretty tight. Because for the most part, you're seeing everybody's going to the same pages, and so you cache those pages with something like begins with a B. I can't remember what it's called.
Varnish?
Varnish. You cache the page with Varnish, and you basically just serve those pages. And because people are looking at the same page, that saves your entire back end because you're just serving the resulting HTML. There's also something called Medusa that we've used, which basically creates your entire website in HTML by following all your links and scraping. that we've used a couple of times for different things. Yeah, they're like, can we use this? And that looks amazing. Sure, why not? But yeah, that's, and again, that was people smarter than me who were really interested in doing load balancing things.
So you put web services under load balancing.
Hmm?
So you put cloud services under load balancing.
Yeah, that would be under load balancing, under architecture. That's,
So advanced architecture.
yeah.
The other one I'd add would be machine learning.
Yeah, I mean, and to me, that would be right under programming. If you're interested in that, especially if you're interested in game design and you want something to react to how the players are doing something, machine learning, natural language processing, vision, computer vision is a big thing.
If you're really into the stock market.
Yeah, yes. I mean, if you're really into this, if you're really into the stock market, like there are so many things on that list because they are with the stock market. They're dealing with just amazing amounts of load and amazing amounts of the amazing importance of latency to the point where they will pay more for a server that's 5 feet closer to the outlet because that amount of cable matters. There was an article that talked about the rush inwards from the servers that various companies use for trading, because a lot of trading is done automatically by computers now. They were moved from like outside of New York to inside of New York to be like that building. Because even at the speed of light, that distance matters.
The ratio is so great that you lose the function of losing the speed of
Oh yeah,
what is happening.
yeah.
It's
Even
so
at the
great.
speed of light, like when you have computations happening
Inches
at the
even
speed of
matter.
light. So, Ori.
So I'm currently learning Rails right now in a bootcamp format, which includes all sorts of kind of people learning, people who've never touched programming before, to people who have, like me, had experience but in other places. And every weekend, the instructor does a live session, and he always, every weekend gets the same question, which is, in a Rails camp, should I learn JavaScript? And should I learn Backbone? Because I want to then learn Angular. Once I do that, I'm going to learn Nginx, I'm going to configure this. And like, the instructor always just says, like, dude, learn HTTP, and then learn Rails, and do that.
Yeah.
And be good at that. And then forget about DevOps and all this stuff. And he's very, like, have one skill and be really good at that. And I find it interesting because you went very broad. So my question is, what do you think about specializing versus being a jack of all trades? And as someone say that they're a junior developer in a specific thing, like, do you recommend focusing until you get to a point where you can handle, because you may never ship anything. You may just be toying around.
Well, so
that's a two-part question.
So, yeah, I was going to say, I think I did more, but so.
I have at least 3 written down here, so I'm trying to get them all in there.
All right. Well, I would have taken 3 questions from you, Corey. It's not like the room's crowded. So, when I say get the basics down, so you should know the basics in your language, and then when you're going, that's why the learn another programming language was kind of at the end of the intermediate, because you should know your language really well before you can start contrasting it to other things. And the stuff about pointers and data structures and everything like that, that's applicable to any language. In fact, realistically, like the complexity stuff and the data structure stuff that's up here, that's any language. It may be hidden from you by Rails, but it's in Ruby. So before somebody starts like going off into learning Angular, get Ruby on Rails down. Know what you're doing in Rails before you worry about having to do the other stuff. Unless if there's a compelling reason, like you're a one-person startup and you have to learn that stuff, well, then you have to learn that stuff. But there is a value in becoming really good in a language. So that's why I was trying to keep this not as learn Ruby, then learn Python, then learn JavaScript. It's learn this stuff in your language, and then then worry about other languages. And I probably should have made that explicit. But the process stuff, that works across languages, and the idea behind the process is the process things is it makes your job easier, or you're making somebody else's job easier. There used to be, when everybody worked in like C and other languages of that level, C, Ada, COBOL, Fortran, they had these things called makefiles that still exist today, but most people don't think about them. And there was a guy, his job was making makefiles and making sure that they worked.
A bunch of guys.
Yeah, but I actually knew somebody who that's what his job was.
Yeah, there's several.
Yeah, and that's process. That is allowing the programmers to do their work, and so that's an important part of a development team is somebody that helps do that. And maybe it's just one of the development team, like that's their concentration. But it's still like a part of all of our technical stuff that somebody can get really into if they want to.
Couple that with the whole UX issue and the people that are focused on requirements generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's, like I said, there is no way in an hour that I can tell you all of the things that might be interesting.
I know.
Yeah, come on.
Just one
I could talk faster.
Just one caveat. Try not to put all those languages into one application. I've seen it done. And I've tried to fix it.
Now, I feel like there was other parts of your question that I missed.
No, my primary question is, well, my second, I guess the one that you didn't touch on, especially the other parts, is primarily oftentimes when I see people learning, and I've done this myself, is getting stuck in the rut of getting a little bit into something and then switching gears because it's the new thing. You never, ever launch anything. And it's like, launch something in, it doesn't matter what it is. Launch something because you're going to learn more by doing something, completing something then.
Yeah, get something done. It doesn't, Buzz made a huge deal that like jQuery is so 2 years ago and they're working in Angular. That's great. I'm glad that they can work in Angular, and they're very into using the new thing. The thing that ships is the thing that people are going to use. If you know PHP pretty well, you have a project, you want to get it done, do PHP. Advance up like the tree of things that you know. Like if for some reason at that point you don't know object orientation really well in PHP, use that as an opportunity to use that project as an opportunity to learn it. But you don't have to suddenly jump to Rails because everybody's using Rails. There are places, Perl was one of the earliest ways of getting stuff done on the internet. And there are still people who use it. It's still in use, it still works, you can still get things done in it. PHP, that's blah, 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 Rails is better. Rails might be better. If you know PHP, you're going to be able to get something done in PHP, use PHP. Okay? You can learn most of these concepts no matter what language you're in. The cool thing about a concept, about a theory, about knowledge about how to do something, like knowledge about how to make loops work or how object orientation works, is it goes across languages. The syntax might be different, but the ideas of what's going on are the same. Did that get you where?
Yeah.
Answer your question. Okay. Well, and please, I don't like. Don't look, just because I have the gray hair, don't look at me as like the person who knows everything.
Too late.
There's great.
There is so much variety in the tech industry. I mean, I've heard of like 5 things today that I had never heard of before. No, you can't learn them. Yes, you can't learn them. You have to finish something in Python.
So I'd like to ask what is horizontal and vertical?
It's been a while since Java class. But vertical inheritance is kind of inheritance how you think normally. So like you have a base class and inherit from it, and in Java, horizontal is like implementing interfaces.
Okay.
So in English. Anything else, or did anybody like? This is also a good space for discussion. Or I mean, it's 6 o'clock. People are probably hungry, so I mean.
Like your name.
Just work.
Thank you guys for showing up. I believe this is the last series of presentations for today, so I encourage everybody to go out and do something interesting, talk to some of the people that are out there, and hang around for the maker stuff. Tomorrow, I will be here tomorrow until probably about noon, and I'll be around tonight if you guys have questions.
They are one big question.
There is nothing wrong with that.
I know. I know. Yes, yes, you mean all this.